We'd now like to introduce our first panel, IACUC Oversight, Addressing the Challenges, Understanding the Consequences, and have the speakers for the panel come up. While they are coming up, I would like to introduce the moderator for this panel. It's Dr. Claire Hankinson. She is the Director of Campus Animal Resources, the attending veterinarian, and also a professor of laboratory animal medicine in the Department of Pathology and Diagnostic Investigation at the College of Veterinary Medicine at Michigan State University. So while we were waiting for them, I was informed by last year's co-group to have a few jokes ready, just in case. So there are two goldfish in a tank. One looks at the other and says, "You know how to drive this thing?" Okay. All right. Well, they're still not up here, so you get to listen to my poor jokes. So I feel uniquely qualified to give this one. How did the blonde die ice fishing? She was hit by the Zamboni. All right. They're going to put you out of your misery and finally come up here.
All right. I am responsible for the April Fool's joke, and we're missing one of our panelists, and that is not a joke. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure what we're going to do, but we'll get started. So we can shake it up, right? We can be flexible. I feel a little like it's The Price is Right, and someone will come running down the aisle in a minute here. So, all right, so we will go ahead and get started, and I want to welcome everyone on behalf of the Planning Committee. Last year, at the final session of the 2015 IACUC conference, a town hall forum was held to foster open dialogue about lingering IACUC issues. Questions have been submitted anonymously throughout the 2 days of the conference, and we selected from the final collection to pose those questions back out to the town hall attendees. Of great interest to me, certainly, the majority of these anonymous questions were not about what's an exception versus an exemption versus a deviation versus a departure, how do we do practice and committee politics. Instead, they largely delved into conflicts of interest between administrators and IACUC chairs about the censorship of opinions, faculty disagreements, and a myriad of internal conflict and confrontations. So this year's panel that we're starting off our session with today was born out of the Planning Committee's hope to directly address those sorts of internal challenges and their consequences. These are the challenges that may lead to disruption, dysfunction, and diminished authority by and confidence in the IACUC process at all of our institutions. Therefore, we're very fortunate to have identified a trio. Oh, wait, is someone coming? Yes. A trio, not a duo, of talented experts and professionals who are going to share their views with us today. So please allow me to, I almost feel like I should do a drum roll. We have all three. Please allow me to introduce them today. And I'd like you to join us if you're interested in more discussion in the breakout session A2 that will be immediately following this panel. So our first and most exciting to have speaker, who's just arrived at the stage, is Dr. Andrew Burmeyer. He has served as the IACUC chair for over 7 years at Oregon State University. He is an associate professor and director of graduate and undergraduate academic programs. He has been a scientific member of the IACUC as well as vice chair and now chair. And so we're very excited to have his perspective on what it's like to lead that group, as many of you in the audience are also IACUC chairs. Our second speaker will be Dr. Cynthia Pico. She's an associate professor of comparative medicine at the University of Washington and serves as the chief of the veterinary medical unit at the VA Puget Sound Healthcare System. Cindy advises and trains on care, research techniques, and prevention of pain or distress in animals and serves as an attending veterinarian on the IACUC. Cindy's had a long history of working within ALAS. She's a past president. She's been involved with ICLS and ALAC as well. And lastly, the third speaker will be Dr. J.R. Haywood. He is the Assistant Vice President for Regulatory Affairs, Professor of Pharmacology and Toxicology, and a colleague and my boss at MSU. He has been an active scientist. He was chair of his department for 9 years. He has been on the council for the accreditation for ALAC International. He's been on the board of trustees. Most recently, he's been the immediate past president for FASIB, and we asked him to join us today in particular because of the significant role that he played in the National Academy of Sciences report, Optimizing the Nation's Investment in Academic Research, a New Regulatory Framework for the 21st Century. So will you please join me in welcoming the three of them, and I will be up to help moderate questions after they speak. Thank you.
Good morning. So, a lot of talks start with a joke, and I guess my joke for today is, as an IACUC chair, don't bump into and initiate a conversation with OLAW on the way to giving your session talk. No relevant personal or professional financial relationship with respect to this activity. And so I'd like to talk this morning about managing potential conflicts of interest as an IACUC chair. And our several learning objectives at the end of this session, I hope we would be able to together describe sources of potential conflicts of interest that may impact on IACUC function. And these can exist at several levels. They can be within the committee itself. They can be between the committee and other institutional entities or individuals. They can also be between the committee and or the institution and outside entities, and we'll mention some examples of each of those. Want to understand the potential risks to the overall program management and to individuals from a failure to adequately address or mitigate conflicts of interest. And we want to describe some practical solutions, again, to identify and mitigate COI. So my relevant experience, why am I here? You heard in my introduction. I'm a serious research scientist, and so I've provided an example of the work that I would do in the laboratory. In starting my own laboratory, I didn't take that long before the students and staff didn't let me do any research, and so I had to amuse myself otherwise. Oregon State is a land grant. It's a major teaching and research institution. We have an animal care program that encompasses agricultural, biomedical, veterinary teaching, ecology and general biology programs, and by that I mean field work. And so we have a fairly diverse program. We're not necessarily the largest institution, so we like to talk about ourselves in terms of breadth, not depth. We are fully accredited by ALAC International, and in my experience on the IACUC, I've served as chair for a number of years, vice chair and a scientific member. In that time, I've served with 5 different institutional officials, 5 different attending veterinarians. We've transitioned from an administrative support structure that included a single classified staff member to a professionally trained and certified administrative faculty. So it's been somewhat a journey of transition, and along the way we've had, I wouldn't say significant issues with conflict of interest, but it's certainly come up and been a discussion item. So take-home message for today. Unaddressed conflicts of interest represent a significant risk to IACUC function and program management. Unaddressed conflicts can erode confidence in IACUC oversight and management of the program and can interfere with the maintenance, development and maintenance of a culture of compliance. However, the good news is conflict of interest can be mitigated through a commitment to open communication, mutual respect, and transparent processes. So I included this slide. Well, really, it's a shameless plug. But I included this slide not only because the Oregon State women's basketball team made the Final Four for the first time ever in their program history, but also because as first-time Final Four, they face UConn on Sunday. And if any of you know UConn has won a game or two here or there. Last 3 championships. And so Oregon State is the underdogs in this match. But I chose this slide not just for that shameless plug, but also because I think it's important in thinking about conflicts of interest to keep in mind the underdog. conflicts of interest arise from differential power structures, right? And if there's a differential power structure, then there is someone who's potentially at a disadvantage, and that someone is the underdog. And as IACUC members, as individuals responsible for program management, it's important for us to keep in mind those underdogs, to identify them and protect their interests. So what is a conflict of interest? I stole this definition from our university conflict of interest definition. The focus is on financial conflicts, and that makes sense because there's a lot of emphasis on recognizing financial conflicts in terms of grants and program administration. And so the definition doesn't quite fit, but there's aspects of it that are absolutely perfect. And so when an employee of the university, for an employee of the university, a conflict in general is when their outside interests affect or appear to affect the individual's professional judgment. And so that's directly relevant to IACUC functions because as IACUC members, we have to utilize our professional judgment in our ethical decision-making process. And if that ethical decision-making process is influenced by conflicts with outside entities just outside to that function, outside to the function of the IACUC, then that represents a problem for committee function. And so those are those conflicts that we need to identify. The existence of a conflict or a potential conflict doesn't mean that that outside interest is influencing the process. It's just a risk. So what are some potential conflicts that might impact IACUC functions? I've indicated 3 levels. So within the committee, some examples. The obvious one, the easy one that everybody thinks of is business before the committee that involves a committee member. And so this could be a project or a facility that's managed by the committee member or personnel that are employed by the committee member. So those are obvious. Less obvious are where there are these potential differential power structures. And so junior faculty versus senior faculty. Such faculty or such conflicts can arise even when those 2 faculty are not within the same administrative unit. Many of you are familiar with how universities run, and it's similar in other institutions, that there are a lot of administrative units within the institution that potentially can influence an individual's success. And that success can be through promotion and retention, those kinds of things. You can have conflicts between the committee and other institutional groups and individuals. And so this, again, similar. This influence might manifest over decisions about allocation of resources, employment or advancement decisions, and can involve other personal or professional relationships. So it's not necessarily a direct interaction. The interactions can be indirect. If there's business before the committee, we're talking about a certain individual, maybe a student, maybe a postdoc, and that person is employed by someone else in the university who's a good friend of someone on the committee. These are indirect and fairly subtle potential conflicts. You can also have conflicts between the committee and the institution and outside entities, and a lot of these involve allocation of resources. These may be financial conflicts having to do with granting agencies, and so the concern is that a decision concerning one project or one grant might influence decision-making by that outside entity over other projects and grants or contracts. So what are the challenges for the IACUC? One is failure to mitigate these conflicts of interest can lead to poor decision-making. And since our decision-making often primarily involves issues of animal welfare, then there are potential for impacts to animal welfare if the decision-making process of the IACUC is compromised. Outside of the welfare of the animals, there are potential impacts to individuals at the institution. A person's professional success, livelihood, their continued employment, their opportunities for advancement are all potentially impacted by our decision making. Similarly, you can expand that up a level and then to administrative units within the institution. Our decision making can impact on a unit's success, can impact on the overall institutional success, the institutional reputation, and so all of these things need to be taken into account. Failure to adequately address conflicts can lead to a loss of confidence in the IACUC. And if your institution loses confidence in your IACUC, your animal welfare program is sunk, resulting from a degradation in that culture of compliance that we're all trying to maintain. The challenge, a significant challenge, is that conflicts may not be immediately apparent or easily identified. So what can be done? The role of the IACUC, in particular the IACUC chair, and the administrative staff, the professional staff that work in support of the IACUC, is to manage the process of IACUC function. And so the IACUC chair has a key role in determining the agenda, leading, managing the process of IACUC discussions, decision-making, and relies on the administrative staff as well to help support those functions. The committee, this is the key part, the committee must have processes that identify potential conflicts of interest and support transparent decision-making. In the end, it all comes down to the committee having an open and transparent process. First, that allows open communication so that all voices are heard. Second, that encourages and supports self-reporting of potential conflicts of interest. Remember, we said that they're not necessarily easily identifiable. And if they're not easily identifiable, we need committee members to have the personal integrity to step up and say, identify where they may be conflicted. And in some of those cases, it may not be the obvious ones, it may be the indirect relationships that we're talking about or concerned with. And then the committee work itself, the processes of the committee, the deliberation, the decision-making, must absolutely be deliberate and scrupulously impartial and transparent. So if there needs to be an ad hoc committee formed to investigate an issue of animal welfare concern or an issue of noncompliance, the process by which that committee is formed, that subcommittee is formed, the process by which that subcommittee investigates the issues at hand must be transparent, must be defendable if somebody questions the process. So in conclusion, unaddressed conflicts of interest can erode confidence in IACUC oversight, the institutional animal care and use program, and can interfere with the development and maintenance of a culture of compliance. We can mitigate such conflicts of interest through a commitment to open communication, mutual respect, and transparent processes. And are we holding for questions here or? Okay, we'll hold for questions. And so thank you for your attention this morning.
Buenos dias. So, the learning objectives for my portion of this discussion is to review some of the challenges to compliance that can be presented when there are cultural and language differences between research personnel, IACUC members, and the administration and making the process of regulation go forward. And I also want to spend most of the time providing some practical suggestions for how we can bridge gaps in understanding and how we can build a culture of compliance when there are cultural and language differences. So what do I know about this? Well, I've worked with IACUCs for a great number of years now, and have much experience with ALAS, which has many international members and members for whom English is a second language. Certainly, it's been a big education in the past 5 years working with the International Council for Laboratory Animal Science, and in addition with ALAC International, where I've had the privilege of doing some site visits in countries other than the United States. And I have to say, though, I think my biggest qualification is being a Spanish speaker, but somebody who was not from a bilingual background, but who started in high school and learned and went through the School of Hard Knocks. And I understand what it's like to be in a conversation where I get 80% of what's going on, and I really want to save face and not let people know that I don't exactly follow what they're going. I know we're talking about the Olympics and which event and who won, but I'm not sure which event it really was. So that sort of thing, but I'm trying to nod and smile and act like, yeah, I get it, I'm with you. And so I understand when other people are in that mode and what it's like to be in there. One example, two of ways in which this has led me astray. I was asked a number of years ago to translate some posters that ALAS was making for International Laboratory Technologist Week. And I was translating them into Spanish, and I was rather proud of what I'd done. But something just kind of niggled in the background of my mind that this isn't quite right. And so I asked a native Spanish speaker to look, and he got a big grin on his face. And he said, you know, I think you meant to say that ALAS is a not-for-profit association. And I had said it was an unprofitable association. And so I totally get where these things can go wrong and where miscommunications can happen. But going back to the whole IACUC and regulatory part of it, I'm going to give you an illustrative story that happened to me right when I was a new postdoc in laboratory animal science at a large research university. And there was a research project being conducted by a visiting researcher from another country. And English was a second language for this person. And the project that he was working on had a great potential for animal distress. He was looking at acrylamide, which is a toxin, a neurotoxin, and looking at how you might be able to figure out how badly the toxicity might go for a person who'd been exposed to it by looking at the levels in their blood. Specifically, I believe it binds to hemoglobin. So he was using rats as an animal model. The animals were dosed with acrylamide at varying doses, and then he was taking blood samples at certain times afterwards to look and see the amount that was still in the blood and how this correlated with the dosing and the timing and so on. And there were humane endpoints put into the protocol. And the IACUC assigned me, as a young postdoc, somebody to monitor the protocol. They did this routinely with protocols where there was a potential for pain or distress for the animals. And so the animals were indeed becoming toxic, and several of them had met the criteria for euthanasia that was in the protocol. And so I explained to this researcher that these animals needed to be euthanized. And he communicated back to me through sign language as well as spoken language that I didn't understand that people were dying from this in his country, and that he needed a few more time points from these animals, and that he was not about to go ahead and terminate the animals. And so I had to go and get the attending veterinarian, and there was much discussion back and forth, and those animals were indeed terminated. And I went back the next day to the animal room, and the shelf where his rat cages were kept was empty. And I went to the lab, and back in a corner in the lab on a cart under a drape were the cages of the animals. And he was rather upset with me for having tracked him down to his lab and look at these animals. And again, I had to get the attending veterinarian. And he was made to comply with the humane endpoints. But I think what this story taught me and was to become more sensitive to where there are disconnects that can happen in compliance. And in this particular case, it was a disconnect on his understanding of who has the authority to stop the work. What is the value of the data to be gained versus animal welfare, animal suffering, animal distress, and the importance of the humane endpoints. So that brought home to me early where we can run into problems along these lines. And in preparing for this talk, I went to the literature, and there's a lot of literature, not in our field, but in about linguistics and communication, and particularly there's some very interesting stuff. How many of you have ever called for a helpline and you've gotten outsourced to a foreign country, and the person you've talked to just doesn't really get it? And there's a lot of literature about that, which was kind of fun and distracting. But basically, what things come down to is there's misunderstanding and there's non-understanding. So misunderstanding would be you tell me that the protocol has to be turned in by Thursday, and